All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Cardiology Grand Rounds at UCSF. We are fortunate to have Dr. Lorrel Toft with us to talk to us about emotional preparation to perform CPR, a new era in lay rescuer CPR training, courtesy of a nomination from Dr. Joe Yang. So I wanted to tell everyone a little bit about Dr. Toft and her many accomplishments. Dr. Toft is an associate professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and Cardiology at the University of Nevada, Reno. She is a practicing clinical cardiologist also at the Carson-Tahoe Medical Center. Dr. Toft did her medical training at Johns Hopkins, both through internal medicine residency, where she was a chief resident, and a cardiology fellowship. Her current and past work has been focused on further improving educational methods to teach CPR to the lay public and to teach medicine to students. And today she will, of course, be talking on her focus on CPR, teaching CPR to the lay public. And she is just so accomplished in that realm, and we really have a thought leader. I'm so fortunate to have her. Just to tell you a little bit about her work in that specific space, in 2016, she won the American College of Cardiology Young Investigator Award for her work on a novel 5-minute method to teach CPR to the public. Through that campaign, over 3 million people were reached in Kentucky with the life-saving knowledge of CPR. She has also studied kind of the laws and policy around requirements of CPR training prior to high school graduation. And she has published on the variability of state law requirements. She is probably the only speaker that we will have that has won an Emmy Award for her novel method for teaching CPR in high schools. I think, I'll leave it at that and just give the floor to Dr. Toft. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thrilled to be here. I forgot to bring my Emmy to put right behind me in a passive aggressive fashion, but I'll try to make up for it by showing you the work. And yeah, thanks to Joe for inviting me to come and speak to you all. We knew each other back on the Janeway firm at Hopkins, and really thrilled to be speaking to you all. I also have to give a shout out to your advanced heart failure team because without violating HIPAA, I recently was outside hospital and transferred a patient who ended up getting transplanted with you all. So thank you for being a partner for that work as well. So today I'm going to try to take you a little bit out of your current realm of being a cardiologist and being very familiar with CPR and ask you to try to imagine what it's like to be a lay person with no medical knowledge who suddenly might have to perform CPR on a loved one. That is a very hard experience to think about and replicate for those of us who write CPR guidelines and who make campaigns to teach CPR to the public, but it's a really crucial piece to remember. And so I'm going to take you through a lot of the work that we've done to try and improve and motivate people to perform CPR in that once in a lifetime, very high stakes situation. But first, tell me your mom's a cardiologist.
What are you doing, Milo?
Without telling me that your mom is a cardiologist.
What?
These are
What
my
are you doing?
kids.
Good. Is it working? Oh, he's alive! Yay!
And you can see the full range of emotion that happens when you have to do CPR on your brother. Never mind if you're the one that got him with a lightsaber in the first place. These are my disclosures. I am grant funded for this work and also have served as a consultant to the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. And I'll actually show you some of that work here today. So we're going to talk about a lot of the data and science behind what I do, which is just trying to teach CPR better and getting more people to do it. But we'll talk about CPR skill retention rates, talk about some of the current training materials and the opportunities for growth in those, and then tell you about the efforts of my group and how we're trying to improve this. And we're also going to talk a little bit about athlete CPR training, which is, of course, top of mind for many people. So many people watched or are now, of course, aware of the collapse of Damar Hamlin during a Monday Night Football game earlier in 2023. And this widely televised and publicized event really motivated a lot of people to think about CPR in a way that they never had before. But I want to take a moment and show you a clip of some of Damar Hamlin's teammates talking about their experience as a person standing and watching this to, again, help to try and get us out of our mindset of knowing what CPR is and think about what it must be like for one of them. So I'm going to try to switch what I'm sharing on the screen. So bear with me for a moment.
But in that situation, like, it was kind of in and out. It was so inconsistent. Like, he came to, he went. You know what I'm saying? You saw, nobody else saw, but we saw the, what's this called?
The heart monitor.
Yes, flatline.
Heart monitor.
You saw
a flatline?
Swear to God.
Wow.
Saw a flatline twice.
Oh my God.
So at flatline, they shocked him. He came back, and everybody was like, it's like a movie. It was such a moment of, like, I don't know, like, it's hard to describe because it's inconsistent on how to feel. Like, you don't know if you want to play.
It's a roller
You know what I'm
coaster,
saying?
yeah.
Like, guys crying. And in that moment, like, I couldn't do anything but other than if I know Damar Hamlin personally, which I do, like a little bro, get your guys ready to go. You know what I'm saying? Like, rally your guys behind them, because if you didn't have something to play for, you got something to play for now. You know what I'm saying?
So that's just a quick clip to remind us of how different this experience is when you've never seen CPR before or seen someone die. Now, pardon the medical inconsistency, obviously they did not shock asystole, but that was what was being experienced, chaos, talking about a roller coaster of emotions. These are really important factors to consider when we're crafting CPR training materials. So I want you to keep that in mind throughout as I'm talking, and we will come back to this later on. So just to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of cardiac arrest, there are 350,000 per year in the US. The average survival is still hovering around the 10 to 12% mark. There's huge geographic variation in survival. So where you live basically determines whether or not you'll survive. There's huge gender disparity, so men versus women. And there's also racial and ethnic disparities in survival, which aren't fully explained by socioeconomic status or neighborhood. And so these are pretty unacceptable disparities when we're talking about the ultimate outcome of death. But I really see this as an opportunity. If we can move the needle by just 1%, that translates into 3,500 people who are spending the holidays at home with their family every year. So if we think about what factors can we actually influence with cardiac arrest survival, well, these are the characteristics that we know that are related to survival. Witnessed, we can't do anything about where someone collapses. Shockable rhythm, of course, they have better survival. We also can't do anything about that. Age, gender, race, these are all fixed variables. But the two things on this list, which are correlated with survival, which I can impact through CPR training, are the time to defibrillation and whether or not they receive bystander CPR, which we now call lay rescue or CPR in the field. So again, we know that this lay responder CPR does improve survival, but the rate of CPR nationally is only about 40%, which is getting better. We are making improvements, but it's not where we want it to be. The variation in survival correlates directly with variation in the rates of CPR. So there's a very tight correlation. However, again, we see gender disparities in who gets CPR, with women receiving CPR less in public than men. Even in virtual reality, women get CPR less than men. And we also see racial and ethnic disparities in CPR training and also provision in the field. So again, unacceptable disparities in CPR. But again, I see it as an opportunity. I sort of do some basic math here. If lay responder CPR is the most modifiable factor influencing survival, and we actually know that CPR training is the strongest predictor of performing CPR, then if we increase the rate and the relevance of targeted CPR training, we could probably improve survival. The American Heart Association set a goal to double the rate of bystander CPR from 31% to 62% by the year of 2023. And as I mentioned, we're at about 40%. So improvement was made, but we didn't hit that metric. Now, if you live in Seattle, their bystander CPR rate is 75%. You're not allowed to die without getting CPR there. But nationwide, we're still hovering around 40%. And this is where my work comes in. So what evidence do we have, though, that MASH training is actually going to make a difference? Well, there was a study published in this small journal you may have heard of called the New England Journal in 2015. And this is in Sweden. So the top graph A shows historic data. The red line is the number of people trained in CPR. The blue dashed line is the the percentage of arrest victims who got CPR before EMS arrived. Now, even back in 1990, they had a bystander CPR rate of 35%, so they started out at a better place. But what you see as the dashed vertical line, this is when telephone CPR came in, so when dispatchers started to help them. But you also see an inflection point where they started to require training to get your CPR training prior to getting your driver's license, and doing mass CPR training in the country. And you see this steep increase in number of people trained, the percentage of those who got CPR before arrival. And if you look at the bottom graph B, that's looking at the survival rate, and it's separating out the green dashed line on the top are those who got lay rescuer CPR. The black dashed line on the bottom are those who did not. So this is basically showing that it wasn't just an overall improvement in survival, it was an improvement in survival because more people were getting CPR at the scene. Now, here's where I'm trying to make a difference, because I'm sure all of you have taken CPR training. It's part of what we have to do to be to do what we do. But for the past really 50 years since we've been training the public in CPR, we've been really focused on the mechanics: chest compression depth, rate, recoil, all very important pieces that actually do impact survival as well. But we have some other problems before we even get to the mechanics of CPR. 50% of cardiac arrests are not recognized. This even includes when dispatch is on the phone. There's another problem here, which I'm quoting a friend and colleague of mine, Katie Dainty. We are not mentally preparing lay rescuers to respond or for the realities of the psychological impact. You may or may not know, but 80% of cardiac arrests occur in a private residence. So most of the time, this is a family member or loved one that you are needing to do CPR on. And our training hasn't addressed that almost at all. We've just said, call 911, push hard and fast in the center of the chest. Again, very important messages, and we've made improvements. But there's a whole piece of this emotional preparation of what you might expect, which we are not getting at. And here's where the type of training that I've started to do, I hope will address this issue. So this is again an opportunity. If we have improved recognition of cardiac arrest, that could lead to earlier CPR. It could also impact the intention to perform CPR. This is a graph, or an image rather, taken from a recent circulation paper that was actually a scientific statement about the importance of the lay responder experience in CPR. You see that performing CPR is all the way on the right of your screen, but there are so many pieces that lead into that decision to actually perform CPR. So there's the unique characteristics of the person. There's the beliefs that they hold, which include their attitudes about performing CPR, the norms about performing CPR, is this culturally acceptable, and the self-efficacy. Can I actually do this? Am I strong enough? Am I trained enough? All of that feeds into the intention to perform CPR, and only then do the skills actually come into play. The type of training that I am now championing focuses on trying to impact these upstream factors to actually improve the intention to perform CPR and to combine that type of intentionality with the physical skills. So we know that you can learn the muscle memory by practicing CPR. I want to also inform emotional muscle memory, if you will, so that when people are encountering this once in a lifetime, hopefully, event, they've already experienced some of those emotions in the training environment and are therefore prepared to overcome those barriers and actually start CPR. So this is the scientific statement that I just referenced, which I'm grateful for because I quote it in every grant application. But this is what my friend and colleague Katie said. There's a critical need for contextualizing CPR training rooted in the perceptions and experience of lay responders to improve the readiness and experience of future responders. This is where I spend all of my time and effort. Let me back up a little and show you some of the work that James already referenced, which led up to what we're doing now. So I first got interested in CPR training in high schools when I was living and working in Kentucky. I was fortunate to get connected to a nonprofit there who was started by an interventional cardiologist in Louisville, Kentucky, who was tired of seeing dead people come across his cath lab table because they hadn't gotten bystander CPR. So they started a nonprofit to just go teach high schoolers CPR. And I was able to get connected with them and start to do some research in this area. So first we started to look at actual legislation. You may be aware that most of the states in the US now have a law requiring CPR training prior to graduating from high school. And you can see as the map goes on with time, more of those states turn red, which means that they have some kind of a law. We're up to 38 states now that require CPR training prior to high school graduation. So that's great, but it still means that there's almost 1 million students who are not getting any CPR training. And we wanted to dive into this further. We had some questions. So how are these laws different state by state? And what's actually happening? Because it's well and fine to have a law, but what's actually happening in the schools, boots on the ground. So we did an analysis of these school laws. This is a few years ago, so there are not as many states colored in here. But what you see is that states in gray have no law requiring CPR training prior to graduation. Those in blue have a law. They require that you use an AHA, Red Cross, or some other nationally recognized program. In green are the states that don't specify what type of program you need to use. The states that have a red dot at the capital are those that also say some kind of AED training must be accomplished, although none of them require hands-on training with an AED. And finally, only the states outlined in red require that the instructor teaching be a certified instructor. This is an important balance because there are a lot of questions about what is called an unfunded mandate. Just requiring CPR training, that can be difficult to find an instructor. And so very few states actually require that the instructor be certified. We then, so here's a summary of those state laws. So most of them say you've got to follow American Heart, Red Cross, or some other nationally recognized program, but only 8% of them require a certified instructor. But as we know, CPR training courses actually differ pretty broadly. The mannequins range from this very low fidelity one to very creepy to very high tech. And instructors also vary from disinterested to probably overly enthusiastic. So we then went and surveyed schools across the nation. So this is again the map of where the laws are which require CPR training prior to high school. The yellow dots represent where we got survey responses from. So we had over 600 schools who responded to us. They were mostly public schools. So this also reflects the nation. And they were split between urban and rural. So a very good representative population of schools across the country. And we asked them some questions about how is CPR training actually being accomplished in your school? And here's what they told us. We asked them who's teaching CPR, and it was widely variable. Here, when I say certified, I mean that they are CPR certified, not that they are a certified instructor. So most of the time it was a teacher or coach who's on campus who knows CPR and they come and teach it. Sometimes it's someone from EMS or nursing, sometimes it's an actual instructor, and sometimes it's just a teacher or coach who says, we got to do this, so I will. And then we also asked them what type of mannequin is being used. And the majority of them used a non-inflatable mannequin. Those are the ones you're probably familiar with, the little Annies. Inflatable mannequins are those ones I showed you at the beginning, which sort of look like a hemorrhoid pillow with a chest plate on top of it. But still a lot of variability in what type of mannequin is being used. And so when we put all this together, our conclusions were that there's some variability in the laws, even though the recommendations are very simple for what should be in a high school CPR training course. And even more importantly, a very wide variability in implementation. Only 23% of our surveyed schools met the standard for a CPR course. So that means in addition to all the students not getting trained, we also have students who are receiving substandard training. Then I went and looked at what is the CPR skill retention like. So these were students who were trained with an American Heart Association type training program. And we went back 6 months later and we measured the rate and depth of the chest compressions that they could do during 1 minute of timed CPR. So these graphs on the left, you see their rate ranging between 50 and 150. And in B, you see the percentage of their compressions that are at appropriate depth. And then the percentage of participants, and this is a histogram. So between the dashed lines on the A graph is the correct rate, 100 to 120. And then to the right of the dashed line in graph B is 70% or greater of chest compressions at appropriate depth. We chose that as our metric because that's about what healthcare providers can do. So then we combined these to say, what percentage of these students could perform high quality CPR as defined by correct rate, and 70% or greater at correct depth. And it was only 12% of the students. So very poor CPR skill retention 6 months later. Now, again, something is better than nothing, but I think we can do better than this. About this time in my research, I was really fortunate to meet this man, Martin Percy. And I tell you this story for the perhaps trainees or early career folks that sometimes your research happens by chance and by luck because you're in the right place at the right time. And that was certainly the case here. So Martin is an interactive filmmaker. He took a CPR training course in the UK, he's based in London, and thought that is so boring. I could make that better. So he then worked with the Resuscitation Council of the UK to create an interactive film. That means that it's a realistic film which immerses you in a drama, but then pauses to ask questions. So you learn through active learning of having to answer between two choices, as opposed to just passively being told what to do. And they made something called Lifesaver. This was designed for your mobile device so that one person could take and learn on their own. And when it comes time to practice CPR, you're supposed to move the mobile device up and down, and the accelerometer measures if you're doing it correctly. That is Daisy Ridley, for those of you who might recognize her as the star of the film. She went on to star in a franchise called Star Wars as Rey. But I like to show this to prove how legitimate our films really are. So they won a lot of awards for Lifesaver. I heard Martin talking about this at Resuscitation Conference. And like everyone else, I approached him to say, we need this in the US. But my idea was we need this in schools. And I want to adapt this in a few ways to really harness the power of interactive film, but to make it applicable to high school classrooms. So we created Heart Class. Heart Class is an interactive film. What we changed about this is now intended to be shown in a classroom setting where the students are separated into two teams. So we add competition, which enhances learning. Again, they are immersed in a very realistic drama, and then the teams are asked questions back and forth for points, and they learn CPR through this very active learning process. We also were fortunate to win several awards, including Webby and the Emmy Award, which is proudly displayed in my home. I'm going to show you a quick clip of Heart Class and what it looks like in action, with the disclaimer that the victim is actually my husband. And so he likes to say that he is an Emmy Award-winning actor, and I'm quick to remind him that he's an actor in my Emmy Award-winning film, rather. So I'm going to show you Heart Class here.
Oh my God, Mr. Ryan!
Mr. Ryan?
Mr. Ryan, are you okay? Call 911!
No,
No,
we're gonna get in trouble.
We learned this in school. Call 911.
Recent research compared.
Most people have no clue that in
sorry for the
2023,
ad.
the
Hang
best
on.
way to make money on Amazon is not.
Right at the drama. Here we go.
Heart Class with traditional American high school CPR training. It tested 400 high school students. With Heart Class, the percentage of students who performed high-quality CPR improved by 50%. So more kids will be able to save lives. How does Heart Class work? Heart Class is designed for high school classrooms with one computer for 30 students. The teacher splits the class into two teams. The teams compete to do CPR and to answer questions.
So what now?
Keep doing CPR.
Sorry. What's the answer, Team Heart?
Stop CPR and move on.
CPR Group 2. Stop CPR now. What's the score for that CPR session?
Why couldn't we just wait for the ambulance to arrive? You're gonna kill him!
No, Sarah, you can't. I have to. No, you can't!
I think Heart Class made me really feel like I was useful. If I was in the real world and someone collapsed like that, I could help them now. Hell yeah.
It made me feel like I could actually save somebody.
So I'm going to show you the data, which, spoiler alert, that we already told you about in that film, but I wanted you to get a sense. Now, you may have seen in one of those shots, I was in a high school gym with 80 freshman students. And if you know, freshman high schoolers are about 13 years old, you can't get their attention no matter what you do. And yet, in this noisy gym full of those students, they were rapt attention watching this film. So there's a lot of power in the realistic and dramatic portrayal. There's also a lot of power in the peer pressure, because as you saw, some of the students are doing CPR while the others are watching. And I'm going to show you why we think that leads to our better results. So we compared heart class to standard training. In standard training, they were using those inflatable mannequins, which are cost effective, but don't really realistically mimic the human chest. And as you can see by the girl in the back in pink, people are doing chest compressions and then pausing to chat with their friends and then doing 5 compressions and then laughing. And so they don't really ever do 2 full minutes of CPR to develop motor memory, no matter what you try to get them to do. In heart class, they're doing CPR along with the heroes of the film, and each segment is timed to be 2 minutes. So every group of students has to continue CPR uninterrupted for 2 minutes. Otherwise, their teammates will start to tell them, keep going, because it's a competition. So our outcome metrics, which is really important to have appropriate metrics and not just say what was the average rate or the average depth of compression, because that's always going to be correct. Instead, we chose this metric of the percentage of students who could perform high quality CPR as defined by correct rate and greater than 70% at correct depth. So here's our results, which we were really happy to publish in JACC. So what you're seeing is percentage of students separated into 3 categories: too slow on the left, just right in the middle, and too fast on the right. And these are the compressions that are at correct depth. And then we're comparing standard training in blue to heart class in red. And so the middle is what we're going for, where they have correct depth and 70% or greater are at correct depth. And you see that heart class wins, and it's statistically significant. This is 6 months after training. Now, 23% of students is still not great, but interestingly, we really replicated that 12% I showed you earlier, very close to that with 15% by standard training. And we have made a massive improvement. So the question is why? Why does heart class win? Well, it's fun. This is different than what they're doing on a daily basis. It's really captivating, and enjoyment is very important for learning and skill retention, especially for adolescents. It's active rather than passive, as I mentioned, so we don't tell them how fast to push. They have to answer the question. And getting a question wrong turns out helps them to learn even better. There's also the peer pressure I mentioned, where they're going to actually do 2 minutes of CPR and not stop to gossip with their friend. And we're combining the psychomotor practice of chest compressions with some stress. The film is very emotional. I have had one student cry when we went and talked to her and appropriately gave her emotional support. It's because her father had just had an MI. She didn't really know the difference between cardiac arrest and MI, but she came back into the room motivated and wouldn't leave until she scored 100% on her chest compressions. So this kind of stress can lead to a good outcome of learning. And then getting back to that figure I showed you at the beginning, I think we are addressing the attitudes, the norms, and the self-efficacy that are the precursors to deciding to do CPR in the first place. That's not measured when I look at skill retention, but I think this is a really important component of what we're doing. So to show some data to back up those claims, we asked students on a Likert scale to say, how much do you agree with this sentence? And for each of the statements, for example, I enjoyed learning CPR on the top left, we asked those trained with heart class, which is the top bar, and those trained with standard training, which is beneath. The color-coded red means that they disagreed with the statement. Gray is neutral, and then green is agree or strongly agree. And so for each of these statements, I enjoyed learning CPR was fun, learning CPR was interesting, I will use it in the future, and I can perform CPR correctly, heart class wins, and it is statistically significant for all of them. So it's more fun and more relevant. And also we're leading to greater self-efficacy, which is that idea I can perform CPR. And then these results persist at 6 months, although remarkably, there are more people in the neutral range. These are high school freshmen. They don't remember what happened last week, let alone 6 months ago. So the fact that we could show a durable impact at 6 months in terms of that they remember doing this and having fun, I think is pretty remarkable for the age range we're dealing with. We also started to measure the emotional response to training. We asked students, what emotions did you feel while watching the film? And we compared Heart Class in purple here to a film by American Heart, which also depicts a cardiac arrest. It is not as dramatic and it's not an interactive film, but it is a depiction of a cardiac arrest that then leads into learning the steps of CPR. And you can see here that the percentage of students who reported an emotional response is far and away higher with Heart Class than with the other film. Here, the statistically significant emotions are anxiety, fear, relief. These are the types of emotions that are experienced by lay responders during a cardiac arrest. We then asked the students, imagine that you're responding to a cardiac arrest of a family member. And then how strongly do you imagine you would feel these emotions? And we only here are reporting the percentage of students who said, I would feel this quite a bit or extremely likely to feel this. And again, we see that Heart Class evokes a more emotional response. This was a small sample size, so we only reached significance for the emotion of nervous, but we still see a trend that these more anxiety, afraid, nervous, upset, which are the realistic emotions, these are the ones that we're seeing by those who are watching Heart Class. We also think that we're improving cardiac arrest recognition by showing them a realistic one. So early recognition should really be the first link in the chain of survival for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, but we kind of gloss right over that. We just tell people call 911, but you have to know that this person is having a real emergency in order to call 911. There's also the problem of agonal breathing. So somewhere around half of victims have some kind of agonal gasps. And again, imagine that you've never seen that before. That looks like breathing to most people. And so this is a very common reason why they don't recognize a cardiac arrest. And even when describing to the dispatcher on the phone, even then are still failing to recognize it's a cardiac arrest. That's important because who gets dispatched and how quickly depends upon how the dispatcher is coding the call. So here's a little visual representation of some of the training materials that are out there. In this one, you happen upon someone who's already down. So you don't see them falling, there's no agonal breathing. In this film, you do see a cardiac arrest, but he's clutching his chest, sort of that classic, and no agonal breathing is shown here at all. In Heart Class, we specifically show agonal breathing. We focus on it with a question that makes them pause and take note of what agonal breathing looks like and explain that this is not normal breathing, and that means that he's dying. So then we went and tried to see, okay, is Heart Class leading to better recognition of who needs CPR? So we created a series of 10 clips of collapses. We were not professional actors who created these clips, but Joe Yang can tell you about the syncope dances that we used to perform on rounds at Hopkins. But it basically had us film seizure and syncope and dehydration, and then several different types of cardiac arrest mimicked. And we showed these clips to students before they got trained and then after they got trained. And we actually did this with our incoming medical students and then also with some of my 9th grade students. So their pre-training scores, how often did they correctly identify this person needs CPR, improved from before training to after training. Pre-training shown in orange, and post shown in blue. Now, as my dean here said, this is a little concerning that 9th grade students outperformed medical students in terms of recognizing who needs CPR. I think I can explain that with medical students feeling a lot of pressure. This was during their orientation week. So they think they need to know and be a doctor. So I think they were more hesitant and more of them circled, I don't know. The 9th grade students couldn't really care less. So they were more willing to guess and probably got it right. So I'm not sure if I'm really showing with this data what I want to, but I think that we're improving recognition of cardiac arrest by showing them a realistic one. I want to take a moment to talk quickly about some of those disparities I mentioned earlier. So even in virtual reality, female victims get less CPR, and some of the published barriers to performing CPR in women include fear of causing injury, inappropriate touching, and again, even in simulated scenarios, rescuers are less likely to remove their clothing. There's also the problem that all of the CPR mannequins depict male anatomy, and So do all the CPR training films. This is starting to get better. You may have seen that there are now attachments for mannequins. There are also female anatomy mannequins out there, but far and away, you're still mostly training on a male mannequin. So we also did a quick survey on the internet and found 11 films that featured a female victim and taught CPR. 11 on the entirety of what we could find on the internet. Then we assessed them for quality, and we measured 6 aspects of quality for a CPR training film. Things like showing them how to properly position their hands, showing the rate and the depth using an AED. So we basically found very poor quality films out there with a female victim. And most important is the bottom item here, female-specific issues addressed. None of these films actually address the published barriers to performing CPR on women. It's just glossed over. So this is something that we're also trying to use film to address. This is the summary of that data. We found 10 that featured a female victim. We've now made one, so that's the 11th. Only 4 of them were high quality. Only 3 of them taught hands-only CPR, so that's modern, and none of them addressed the barriers. We also tried to look at ethnic and racial diversity within training films. So here we actually went and evaluated available training films from Red Cross, ARC in orange, American Heart in blue, and then also ones that we found online. And here this data I know is a little bit dicey, but we have a lot of good precedent for using what someone perceives a person to be has actual health impact on their outcomes. So we had a diverse group of reviewers of all different genders and ethnicities, self-identified, review these films and say how they perceived the mannequin, the rescuer, the victim, and the instructor to be. We qualified it as white or non-white, which again doesn't feel great, but there is again precedent for that we see that non-majority appearance also has these health outcomes. And so here we look to see what percentage of these films had a non-white appearing character in a specified role. And the victim was non-white appearing in 40% of films, but the rescuer, mannequin, instructor, we did not have a lot of racial diversity. This is also important because when we are teaching these life-saving skills, there's a lot of data about seeing yourself on the screen is an important part of identifying with that message and saying, that's me and I can do this. So we also think that there's room for improvement in our racial and ethnic diversity in these films. And from the online videos that we were able to find, 10 high quality videos had at least one non-white appearing character. So some diversity, but still a lot of room for improvement. So this then led to the consultant work that I told you I did with the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. So they saw Heart Class when I presented it at a conference and said, we want to bring this to Canada, but we want to be the first in the world to address the female victim. So we actually created the first in world high quality CPR training film teaching hands-only CPR, specifically addressing some of these female issues. We did this in English and in French, and we're fortunate to win several Webby Awards for this. This is now being used in the instructor network in Canada to train. We're up to about 1,000 people so far have been trained with this method. We're very excited with the reactions that we're getting. Don't have any data to show you, but we think this is a really important step in trying to address some of that gender diversity and female-specific issues. So now let me get back to sports-related arrest, since that's how I started this whole thing, and talk a little about how we're diving into that world as well. I basically think that interactive film can be used to teach CPR to anyone if we make it specific. As we all know, Damar Hamlin had his cardiac arrest and has now become an absolute champion for CPR, and we're very grateful for how he's used his tragedy to raise awareness around the country. I was actually giving this talk to Cedars-Sinai, and a colleague there, Chukwuemeka, is a sports cardiologist. And afterwards, he said, we need to collaborate because I think that there's a problem with sports-related cardiac arrest. And the problem is that it's never the athlete who does CPR on the other athlete. It's always the coach or the trainer. That's all well and good when you're on a Monday night football game and you have a dozen trained professionals that are ready to respond. But what about the middle school where there's no trainer on site when they're practicing? And what about these tragedies we see with young people? We need to be training athletes and telling them that the closest person is the best person to do CPR. And I think we can do that with interactive film. So first we had to do some needs assessment. And so we started to dive into how are we trying to prevent cardiac arrest in athletes in the first place. So many of you might be familiar with the pre-participation exam. For those greater than 12 years old, everybody has to go and see a cardiologist or a sports medicine physician and get, quote, cleared to play. Don't we love that? However, the data is, while this is useful, what we've seen is that communities who have large-scale pre-participation exams versus those who do not, the rates are really identical because these are very, very rare occurrences. So some of the experts in this field have raised questions about the cost effectiveness and unintended consequences of some of these screenings. Not to question whether they should happen at all, but just to raise, are these really doing what we want them to do? Another piece of this puzzle is something called an emergency action plan, which every sports organization needs to have. These, all of them say that the coach or the trainer are the first responders in the case of sports-related cardiac arrest, but none of them specify fellow athletes as being first responders. There also here exist a lot of disparities. So there's ethnic and racial disparities in outcomes and in whether or not a trainer is present. However, we know that CPR and AED use are tested, effective, established methods of preventing sudden death. It doesn't prevent the event in the first place, but can prevent sudden death. And so some experts in this field have said, perhaps we should be focused more on AEDs in our places of recreation and CPR training. And as many of you are probably aware, in response to Damar Hamlin's event, there's now the Smart Heart Coalition, which essentially every sports and every medical organization are part of. And they're starting campaigns to get AEDs into schools and places where people are doing athletics. But we also wanted to know, well, what's the mindset of the athletes? So we surveyed about 100 athletes. These were all at the collegiate level. This was before Damar Hamlin's event that we got this data. And we asked them, do you know what sudden cardiac arrest is? And are you concerned about it? Here you see the responses based on those who are CPR trained in red and those who are not trained in blue. And here, the athletes who said they know what CPR, what sudden cardiac arrest is, was kind of surprisingly small, although different for those who had been in CPR training, though only 60% or so of them knew what it was. And none of them were concerned at all about what was happening. Now, again, this is pre-Damar Hamlin. We're repeating this survey now, and we're interested to see if this concern upticks, and then we suspect that it will go down again. But we also looked into published sports-related cardiac events that we could see who performed CPR. We found 57 cases either in media or through YouTube or through a database called Parent Heart Watch, where we were able to actually identify who was the first person who responded. And in the vast majority of those, it was a non-athlete trained personnel who responded, a coach or a trainer. In the very rare cases when a fellow athlete responded, in 4%, they were actually trained first responders already, so they were a lifeguard or something else. And so it was really only 5% of these 57 cases that we found where it was a true lay responder athlete who responded. This is despite being closest to the fallen athlete, and we know that for every minute delay, survival decreases by 10%. So this we see as an opportunity for improvement. So we just published this in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, and our hypothesis is that this limited knowledge and minimal concern leads to fewer athletes actually being responders. And we think that we can train them. So we actually got a grant from the American Heart Association to create a sports-focused interactive training film. And we're going to be showing that to athletes either at their pre-participation exam, which is required in college, or at team training events, and see what's the most effective method to teach CPR to athletes. We also were fortunate to get an NIH grant where we're trying to take this whole interactive film and basically turn it into a video game by creating a device which I'm not at liberty to disclose. So with that, I want to thank all of the partners who have made this work possible and many institutions and organizations. Also, as a note, it is really fun to do research by making films. We're in the process of making 3 more later this month. So I'm a movie producer, I guess now. I didn't get trained for that, but having a lot of fun trying to make this look realistic. And also thanks to my husband who likes to play dead there and all of the people who helped us. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Toft, for a wonderful talk. I will say that everyone can feel welcome to drop their questions in the chat or, you know, unmute yourself and ask. But I guess I'll get ourselves started. And again, thank you for your important work. Sudden cardiac arrest has been viewed as an intractable epidemic, and I think a lot of people have tried to move the needle. And you know, I'm very convinced that this is an integral part of moving that needle, as you spoke to. What are the next steps for a heart class in terms of distribution and implementation?
Yeah, great question. So this is one of the challenges that we've faced. I'll say that, how can I say it without being too political? So the idea of CPR certification is actually a barrier. Whenever I approach schools or organizations, the first question they ask me is, will I be certified? Being CPR certified is made up. Right? That's not really, it's just made up that you took a course from a large organization. And again, not that that is inappropriate or unimportant. I sit on committees with the AHA, and I was just there in September and said that to all of our representatives in the room, certification is a barrier. So I see this really as filling that gap for the unfunded mandate in schools. And we have had implementation in Washington, Kentucky, and Nevada. Distribution and recognition is also one of our areas that we're working on. Because I work with the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation, and they made sort of Canadian heart class, it's probably rude for me to say, they have a very large distribution network. And so this method is now being used broadly across Canada, which I'm very excited about. And then through the NIH grant that we just got, it's actually an STTR grant to develop a product. And so we have hopes and for collaboration with some of the large organizations that this then could become the CPR in schools method that is preferred. But it is very challenging to get into schools, and I'm knocking down doors. So any contacts are appreciated. Oh, I forgot to mention something important. Heart class requires no instructor. There is a teacher's guide that tells them how to set up the room. And then they press play, and that's it. And this is really important because an instructor and instructor time is one of our biggest barriers. So that's something we're trying to overcome.
Great. Thanks for all your efforts. I'll open the floor for any other questions.
I see one from Cody in the chat asking about how the opioid epidemic has impacted people's willingness to approach someone who is down, particularly in low income and urban center communities. And it seems like people have a high threshold to stop and check if they're okay. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. We have not dived into trying to combine this with Narcan training. That's something of interest to us, but getting the funding for that has been a little bit challenging. But certainly there is some compassion fatigue, or just saying, they're probably just down from opioids. We do see that reflected in that rates of lay rescue or CPR do vary by neighborhood. And unfortunately that varies by socioeconomic status within neighborhoods. So that really is a problem. The other side comment I'll make is that the COVID pandemic also really impacted this. We saw a lot less lay rescue or CPR in COVID because of all the fears of transmission, of course, even with doing hands-only CPR. We've thankfully started to see that right itself, but that was a real concern as well, and probably will continue to be.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I, James, can I make a comment?
Please.
I put it in the chat, and it's an additional thought. Lorrel, thank you so much. This is really superb. And what we decided to do after Hamlin, and I envy you that you could get to him, we couldn't. We deliberately put the paper in sports medicine. And I really do think that there is a dearth of publications in those kinds of journals, including what you're doing. And that's really, it's needed because you want to reach the right audience. Cardiology, a lot of us, I mean, great. And We know, but the unwashed masses out there, they're the ones who really we should be talking to. My other issue, and that came up during the preparation of this paper, the registries on cardiac arrest, where are they're all over the map.
Yep.
Why can't you guys go to Washington, wherever it takes, and put a registry in place so that we know what we're talking about when we look at public health relevant information like this?
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. Couldn't agree more. There is a lot of talk and funding being put towards some national registry, but in Canada, they have such a registry. They actually have a registry of all events of survivors of their families and are able to then make pretty extensive networks. We have the CARES registry in the US, but that depends upon individual EMS agencies to participate, and it doesn't happen everywhere. But at the recent meeting I was at AHA, there's actually been some funding to go into places that aren't involved in CARES registry and do some more robust involvement. But it's desperately needed, because even trying to figure out how many sports-related cardiac arrest events occur, we don't even have the epidemiology for that. And then my response to your question about preaching to the choir, couldn't agree more. It's also hard to find a home to publish these things, interestingly. So the sports stuff I just showed you, we publish in American Journal of Emergency Medicine. But getting to the places where we need, which is really the public, is what matters. So I'm hopeful about the Smart Heart Coalition that the NFL has put together and championed. So through that initiative, every NFL program or club, they call it, can submit a grant for $20,000 to support local CPR and AED in schools. Now, that $20,000 doesn't go very far, but it's definitely a start. So I'm actually working with the Raiders in Nevada, for example, to say we need the power of the recognizable names of these institutions. And if you put that behind a request to a school, they're very much more likely to answer an email from the Raiders than they are from Lorrel Toft at UNR. So I think that I'm hopeful that this coalition can have some legs, but it remains to be seen how far, or if this will become an issue that was in the background. We did a good thing once and now we're done. So I hope that this becomes a sustainable effort, but thank you also for the work that you're doing. And then, a question about influencer marketing is super powerful method, and how can we use the prominent athletes? Yeah, so again, Damar Hamlin is just, he has become an absolute champion for this, which is absolutely remarkable. And I think he alone has done more to move this field forward than many of us could hope to. For what I've heard from American Heart is that donations usually lag, and they are up into this particular area because of his influencer status. So getting to the right people is really crucial, and that's where partnerships come into play. So I'm also looking, so any of you who are connected to the rich and the famous, please let me know, because I will give them this pitch in 2 minutes and convince them of why it's so important. But I do think athletes are very powerful community champions. And so we hope that with what we're doing to start training athletes in CPR, they will become more knowledgeable and then become champions in their communities as well. We also are hoping that with what we create, we'll start to get people parodying it, because that's very powerful. When people make fun of you on TikTok, that actually leads to more views. So we're hoping for some of that from our future products. Yeah, so question about LeBron James. So Bronny James, LeBron James's son, who's due to start playing basketball for USC, had a cardiac arrest during practice. So not televised, but widely publicized. So yes, I think treading lightly is always a challenge, but all of us in the field are hopeful that LeBron James might become a champion for this. And I am hopeful that I will have something to show him very soon that might pique his interest in this topic.
All right. Well, I think we're just about at time. Thank you again, Dr. Toft. And although our YouTube division page is nothing like the influencer TikToks as you're alluding to, we're going to be very happy to share your work on our YouTube. Thank you all for joining and your participation, and thanks again, Dr. Toft.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was really fun to talk with you today. Thanks for your interest in this unusual work.